Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have another great show for you today. You may have noticed that sitting in for Robbie today is my esteemed colleague, Niall Stanage, White House columnist for The Hill. Welcome back, Niall.
Great to see you. Always a pleasure.
Now, obviously, we don't have the exact same right-left dynamic.
You're kidding. Are you sure?
It's a little bit different, but I do think that there are so many kind of points of diversity even within kind of like the broad left and the broad right. And I think that's part of what this show demonstrates, right? Robbie isn't your average Republican. I certainly am not your average Democrat. And so I think there's a lot of...
And I'm trying to slalom around between reporting and analysis and not get too deep into partisan opinion.
Yes.
But no, it is important, I think, to have shades of opinion represented as well.
Yes, well, that's what you're getting today. More shades, different shades of opinion, and I hope you enjoy it. Now, getting to our top story today, fallout from President Biden's immigration plan. Now, if you think that Biden's new plan looks familiar, that's because it is. In fact, in 2018, former President Trump relied on the same asylum law provision to keep migrants out of the country. On Tuesday, President Biden, through executive action and stepping over Congress, temporarily closed the border to asylum seekers. Now, migrants who illegally cross the border will be blocked from entering the U.S. and claiming asylum after a 7-day average of unauthorized crossings passes 2,500 people. Now, the action marks a sharp reversal for Biden. In 2020, he ran his campaign on the promise that he'd end Trump's draconian immigration policies, which barred most asylum seekers, and Biden followed through on the promise soon after taking office. The New York Times, trying to explain Biden's shift, wrote, quote, "The politics of immigration have shifted as record numbers of migrants have crossed into border communities and spread to cities far beyond. Mr. Biden has adjusted accordingly, sensing that Americans want tougher policies. The president backed restrictive measures in bipartisan legislation this year. After Mr. Trump called on Republicans to kill that measure, Mr. Biden and his advisors felt compelled to find another way."
But many Democrats were less understanding. Let's take a listen to Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley.
It is extremely disappointing that this White House would choose to double down on the previous administration's harmful and flawed immigration policies that would gut the asylum process, deny immigrants their due process, and put vulnerable families back in harm's way, especially Black, Brown, and Indigenous migrants.
Now, Congresswoman Cori Bush had a similar view. She tweeted, quote, "Seeking asylum is an internationally recognized legal right. It's disgraceful that the Biden administration has failed to uphold it. POTUS must stop taking pages from the GOP's Playbook and instead work towards building an equitable and humane immigration system." Meanwhile, Republicans have been questioning the timing of Biden's order. For example, Senator John Cornyn of Texas tweeted, "If President Biden wanted to secure the border, why did he wait until now? The simple answer is he's not serious about it. This is a conversion based on the proximity of the next election and sinking poll numbers."
Yeah, so I just don't understand this for a lot of different reasons. I think up top, I'm concerned about what Biden thinks he's going to gain out of this. A lot of the criticisms from the right and the left are legitimate. When conservatives say you haven't cared about this issue for your entire presidency and now you're doing it because you're worried about polling, that's completely true. But I also take the critique of someone like Julian Castro, who did a really long and interesting thread about this morning, where he said, you didn't make any effort to make the case for a progressive version of an immigration policy. You put something out on day one, haven't talked about it since, and only now are trying to court the right on this. And of course, it's going to be seen transparently. He's not saying this, I'm saying this now. It's going to be seen as a kind of transparent bid for conservative voters that, and this is important, are not going to come back to you anyway, who were never with you and are not going to take the facsimile of a conservative position on immigration over the real thing and Donald Trump.
Well, I kind of half agree in the sense that I think that there is a real issue here. People have a legal right to claim asylum, for a start, right? And that right is being circumscribed or closed off by this measure. Now, I think where you and I would probably have different perspectives is in the polling, it is clearly a very, very big vulnerability for Biden. And it's, generally speaking, his worst political issue. And people favour Trump by significant margins on it. So what should Biden do about that in your... I mean, do you think that the more progressive... that there's a way to shift the debate itself in a more progressive direction?
Well, frankly, now it very well may be too little too late. But that doesn't mean go to the right if you're not actually going to get any votes by doing so. And you also are very inclined to lose votes from your left-leaning, basic normal liberal supporters who voted for you back in 2020 because they were told you got to stop these draconian policies from Donald Trump. There's, a fascist at the gate. He's putting kids in cages. He did the Muslim ban. Like, all of that was such a significant motivator to people to get to the polls in the previous cycle. And so I want to come back to this idea of whether this is going to actually help Biden on the other side, because there was this study that came out of Oxford back in January that demonstrated that when liberal, left-leaning politicians make these kinds of bids to the right policies, it actually helps them it hurts them rather in their electoral bids as opposed to actually boosting them. So I take your point that this is a genuine vulnerability for Joe Biden. But I think the point that Castro was trying to make was this vulnerability was on the horizon from the beginning. And you had the ability to spend the first 3 years of your candidacy offering a different prescription for what could resolve the legitimate crisis at the border in a way that didn't undermine hundreds of years of asylum law and our kind of moral commitments that are literally emblazoned on the base of one of our most iconic symbols of what it means to be an American, the Statue of Liberty. There's also a way, I think, to go about this that takes more care to preserve the asylum process, because asylees, I think, are the most sympathetic of all of the categories of immigrants if we have to tranche them out in this way. And so I think he's made himself very vulnerable to this attack precisely because he has, believe one of the provisions is really shortening the amount of time that asylees have to consult with an attorney. If you have a backlog, which you very much do have, of people seeking asylum, and that backlog does need to be resolved more quickly, not just because of kind of anti-immigrant concerns about immigrants making false claims and then lounging around in America while they're waiting for their ticket to come up and actually have their claims adjudicated, but also because genuine asylees need to have some certainty to be able to start their lives and get jobs and live their lives here in America. You need to hire more administrative law judges. You need to get to the root of what the backlog actually is. But treating asylum seekers like they are de facto bad faith asylum seekers is exactly the kind of policy that Republicans back. So again, if you're a voter, why do you, if there's no difference now between the two groups on this issue, why wouldn't you just, if you're a conservative, go ahead and keep voting for Trump? And if you're a Democrat, say, well, what is even the point of view at this point, Joe Biden?
Sure. No, so two things to that, Brie. Firstly, I don't at all dismiss the argument that you're making where has there been a case where Democrats have allowed the debate to shift rightward. It's only about a decade ago since President Obama, by executive order, created the Dreamers. And it's almost inconceivable that a Democratic president would do that at this point. Now, I do think, though, there's also the question of, has the political climate been changed by a kind of Democratic timidity on the issue, or is it the numbers themselves that have changed the situation? Like 300,000 people, I think it was, in December. There are... one of the reasons immigration, I think, is so difficult to talk about is some opposition to migrants racist or xenophobic or nativist? Yes, absolutely. Also, there are reasons why people in already marginalised border communities can have genuine concerns about, strain on infrastructure, people without work authorization lowering wages or lowering worker protections. There are non-racist reasons to be concerned about those kind of numbers.
Yeah. So to that, I would say this is part of why I think there's so much frustration on the left. Like I think the far left, the real left, I would say, about the failure to try to do any of that sort of messaging. What you're describing is a kind of crabs in a barrel scenario that has led to so many destructive policies and, frankly, kind of bigoted, racially driven outcomes in the United States of America. I think Heather McGhee, kind of a social scientist, calls this drain pool politics. When you think there are limited resources, it's very easy to say, well, this group shouldn't get the resources because how else are you going to try to preserve anything for yourself? So you start emptying all of the swimming pools across America when integration orders are put into place. And I don't have a swimming pool, but now the Black people don't have a swimming pool either, right? So I think that one way to get at that is to stop making people feel so precarious. Why do so many people feel like there's absolutely nothing more that they can give, that they can't share anything else with their community? If there are people in the bottom tranche of the American economy who are being underserved, which there absolutely are, what would happen to the concern about immigrants if there are alternatively progressive policies that are being pushed and amplified that are showing a clear direction of how your life is going to get better? We're going to do an interview in the show a little later about the recent election in India, and the guest used an interesting turn of phrase when discussing how much Hindu nationalism versus kind of economic concerns were driving the outcomes there. And she says, well, you can't eat Hindu nationalism. At the end of the day, part of why Modi wasn't as successful is because people's economic concerns outweighed whatever their kind of religious commitments were all about. And I see something similar as possible in the United States of America, but it's been so long since we had a liberal party that was genuinely offering meaningful material benefit to the population who is disproportionately, rightly so, I think, disproportionately negatively affected by immigration. And then one other little point in this would be to say, if you extend the same rights and protections to immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, that Americans get, then they get paid under the table, they're able to undercut the workforce. All of those things go out the window because if you have to pay them the same as Americans, well then suddenly you might as well hire an American. And so there's a way that trying to treat immigrants badly ends up coming back to bite the butt of the American worker.
Sure. No, I agree. But I think, if we were having more of these discussions, we'd be able to. I think a lot of these debates, talking of shades of opinion, would be between sort of incrementalism and more fundamental change. I get the point you're making about improving economic security, but if Biden loses the election, that economic security isn't going to come from a Trump presidency.
Well, certainly not. But frankly, at this point, it looks like Biden's going to lose the election either way. And I would argue that he is more likely to lose the election chasing these kinds of policies because it's too little too late. Like, I completely agree. He is in a pickle right now. One other thing that I would say, though, is when you talk about the numbers driving the kind of unpopularity of Biden's approach on immigration, we also have to note that the immigration numbers are way down right now. So again, we're not in a place where instead of telegraphing that, instead of making an affirmative case for why a different strategy is necessary or why these border policies don't actually really affect the number of people at the border, that these are cyclical things that have to do with weather and farming patterns and crime rates in other countries and political unrest in other countries and all these other kinds of things. He's really feeding into the conservative narrative that this is the kind of thing, being draconian with your asylum policy, is going to change how many people are fleeing turmoil from Honduras or wherever it is.
Oh, 100%. And the other thing about immigration that makes it so hard to discuss sometimes is it's this incredibly complicated issue, and people often want to say, well, it's all brown people's fault or racist.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that was spirited and diversity of opinion enough. Stick around. We've got a lot more Rising coming up for you next.